Hi there, how are you?
Good. How are you doing?
I'm fine. That was a fascinating conversation you were just having. I feel like there was an opening at the end there about stories and myth building that I would love to keep talking to you about in terms of
Yeah.
technology, actually.
But
Um,
please take the prompt. Yes, I was gonna.
yeah.
I would love to ask you about some of these things and from some of your work as well.
Well, can I first turn it back to you and say, as someone who engages with technology, and you were talking a little bit about the concerns about how, technology can always be used for good or ill. It will always be used for good and ill, probably. Um, that's kind of in the nature of it. But the ways that we tell ourselves stories about what technology is and what it does and doesn't do for us, or how it does or doesn't threaten us, seem to be particularly um, destabilized right now and crystallizing into something potentially new. Um, I, for me, I think of it in terms of climate change, but I'm wondering what you think about where our myths are right now and how they're changing.
I mean, it's an interesting question. First, how do you build new myths is an interesting question, and it's something that I wrestle with a lot. I mean, we're kind of one of the things working on is this multi-millennial clock that's meant to change the way people think about time and our relationship to it, and how responsible we are for future generations. Are we being good ancestors? None of these things are going to be solved with a conference or a white paper, and so what we're trying to do is do this kind of intervention that is in its own mythic, at least a mythic scale. And so hopefully people will start telling stories about that and how it makes them feel, and hold that kind of reflection up of a deep future in front of them. I think we often are thinking of ourselves at the end of a story rather than at least in the middle of a story. If you look at the
Did you,
last
forgive me, but
10,000
did you
years.
already tell the story about the oak beams?
Oh, I didn't tell that story,
Will you
but I
tell that
think
story, because
that's
I think it's
it,
amazing.
it's also it's great in that it's like many good myths, it's not true, but so
I'm so disappointed. That's
it's an
terrible.
apocryphal story, but I'll tell you some things about it at the end. So yeah, so one of the things, and it's the thing that really got the Long Now Foundation, where I work, started. It was originally told from Gregory Bateson to Stuart Brand, as I understood it, but when New College, Oxford, was being built, and it was the New College in the 1200s, and they had these huge oak beams that were put over the main hall, the main dining hall, and 500 years later, they were found to be rotten, and infested with beetles in the 1800s, and they didn't know what to do because you couldn't really buy trees like this anymore in Europe or in England, and
And they
it
didn't
wasn't.
really grow anymore, right? Like they just sort of weren't growing.
Well, you could grow them, but they would take these trees actually took hundreds of years to grow to the size that were needed, and it wasn't until they spoke to the school forester who said, "Oh, well, we have the trees that you planted," and this idea that some an act as simple as scattering acorns on the ground, leveraged over 500 years, could solve an intractable problem in the future. It has other elements to it where they also needed the cultural um, continuity to remember that they had planted these trees. And so while it seems that this particular story, as I mentioned, is not exactly true, the forestry practices were in place, and this did happen. And we've seen other stories like I think it's the Swedish Navy, the royal forester called them and said, "Oh, we have the masts that you planted, they're ready," and this was 200 years after they were planted. And I think it's a kind of a different story in that they were trying to solve an intractable problem that could only be solved over hundreds of years of growing trees to the size that they needed for masts. But naval technology clearly had moved to the point where they were worthless. These, well, not worthless, they were great trees, but I think they were, as the Royal Navy no longer needed massive straight pine trees to make masts out of. So, but I think going back to the New College Oxford story, is it's now is a myth, and it doesn't really matter how true it is so much as it it changes the way we think about how you could leverage something simple over time, and how you can have cultural continuity that can save you from something that, if you forgot it, would be kind of an intractable problem again. And there's stories like this in Japan. There's a lot of these. For instance, they put hundreds of years ago, some of as old as 500 or 600 years, when there was massive tsunamis, they would put markers, and they'd say, do not build below this line. This is where the tsunami would get to, and they did build below that line. And so they're now kind of rediscovering these markers as these warnings that were sent forward through time, and they failed to become a myth. But there was another one that was a small little temple that was built on a rise, and the temple story is that people ran to this temple because it was on higher ground, and then they were killed in a tsunami where there was two bodies of water, or two ways that water could come in, would focus and then would actually took this high ground out. And so that was always the story of that temple. And so when the 2006 tsunami hit, people did not go there. And it was kind of the successful mythic story where the myth saved the lives of people, 600 years after it came.
There seem to be two really interesting things in here that, for me as a person who thinks about climate change and sort of deep past and deep future, and also very near future. The one is the idea that there's a lot of talk right now about how sort of like human nature and or human cognition make us incapable of thinking long term or understanding geological time or planning in these very long term ways, which I think that if you look at history, you can see that there are ways that societies have functioned differently in different eras under different contexts, where deep, long time was built into the fabric of society. And therefore, this idea that like it's just human nature, we're not capable of planning beyond the next 3 minutes, strikes me as incredibly dangerous right now as a mythology that we're beginning to tell about ourselves, which is incredibly self-defeating mythology. The other thing in these stories, as you're telling them to me, that I hear is this question of communication, right? It's making me think about there was the book that John DeGata wrote about the nuclear waste facility, where they're putting this incredibly toxic material into the ground that's going to be in the ground for like 1 million years or something, at which point it will begin to degrade and become poisonous. And so they had to figure out a way to communicate to humans so far in the future that we can't actually imagine what like symbolic patterns they're going to be using to communicate with each other. Right, like
Yeah.
language, written language, English, is that around?
Right.
Pictorial
Well, and
things.
if you look at the markings on King Tut's tomb, they basically, they were all the things that you would put on the outside of a nuclear waste dump, right? It's like,
Right.
you will get sick, your family, your
Mhm.
generations after you will get sick. This curse will be on your family, all these things. And there
Right,
was
and that
nothing more
definitely kept us
enticing
out, right?
than that. When they read that, they're like, there's definitely gold on the other side of this
There's
door.
something good in there.
Yeah, no,
Right,
we've worked with
yeah.
the DOE on that particular kind of storytelling issue, and I've done conferences with all the different world's kind of geologic repositories, and I visited some of them. There's the 100,000 year facility in Helsinki, and the 10,000 year facility here in the United States. And it's a very strange bedfellow of groups who are trying to build things that last for thousands of years, just the way we are. To kind of they're the only ones doing it, at that same scale and with a lot of science and budget and rigor. But they all agree, kind of behind closed doors, all of the managers of those repositories all agree that the right answer is to not market.
Mm,
Don't market these repositories. But that is an
mm,
impossible political answer to give,
mm,
because they've been handed this kind of mandate of, you need to give 100% assured over 100,000 years or 10,000 years or 1 million years that nothing's going to go wrong. And that's just it's an impossible thing to be handed. And
mhm,
so they're often criticized, I think, for their efforts in this. But one of the best solutions I heard to the marking problem, that Danny Hillis, who I worked with, he suggested, is that you actually don't mark the site. You make markers around, the whole, let's say, the Southwest region, if you were going to bury nuclear waste in the Southwest. And each marker would really be a kind of a cultural test and a scientific test that would lead you to the next marker. And then once you solve all the puzzles, it would tell you where the nuclear waste is, by solving all of the puzzles. And so it would assure that you would kind of understand the danger of what you're dealing with, before giving you the location. And the first thing you have to do is kind of, once you're talking about distances, this deep in time, is you have to kind of set some cultural kind of touchstones that allow you to, like, are you the same kind of, do you care about the same kind of things that I cared about?
Right.
And do you, what is safety, mean in a biological sense for somebody 10,000 years from now, who may be largely robotic or heavily modified from what we would consider a normal human. And so you kind of have to first find that common ground of humanity, and then express what the danger was to at least our
Has
version.
anyone turned this into like a film yet, where humans encounter one of these markers and have to figure out what to do with it? This sounds like a fantastic plot
I,
for a novel or a film. So
I mean,
someone should do this.
there's a there's a book called Canticle for Leibowitz, which was a
Mm,
book about people finding our era of artifacts far, far in the future, and making all kinds of suppositions about it, the way we, as archaeologists, I think some of your work
mhm.
do, or like we kind of
Yeah.
make we tell ourselves a story that makes sense in our world,
Mhm.
of very scant evidence of that stuff. But I don't know that I'm trying to think of, in a way, kind of 2001 with the obelisk on the moon. There was kind of a version of this.
Right.
There's those kind of ones, but I don't think anyone's done one of with the nuclear
Oh,
waste.
well,
There's Anathem, a book by Neil Stevenson, had nuclear waste, but he actually used the mechanism of the clock that we're building as kind of the way that you would keep a,
mm,
a society paying attention to things like that were dangerous over time, like nuclear waste.
mm. These are such interesting questions, and also it's politically not expedient to say stop making the dangerous waste, right? I mean, one
Yeah.
answer is
Well, and we
don't
already
do it.
have it. Like we have to do something with, we have a huge
Yeah.
legacy of every nuclear power country has this legacy of, it's not just, we think of it as like, oh, well, it's nuclear waste from nuclear plants. No, it's like, it'll be like the entire
Mhm.
Oak Ridge facility has like a
Yeah.
layer of nuclear of radioactive dust over the whole thing, and it's made of wood, and it's slowly collapsing, and they don't know what to do with it, right? It becomes this super fun site.
Mhm.
So there's, it's the clothing that people wear at nuclear plants, that they have to dispose of, and where do that's also part of that. So it's a highly variable kind of space of dangerous material. I do also think that people that we've used it as a way of, let's say, arguing against nuclear power, which also I think has a lot of benefits as being a largely green power in terms of carbon emissions. But many countries have been taking nuclear power off the table because of the waste problem. And when you look at the waste problem, yes, you could bury the waste, and someone might find it in the future, and they might get sick. But for instance, the number of people who probably have been injured in or died in a car crashes going back and forth to conferences talking about how to protect us from nuclear waste is probably way more than the number of people that would get harmed in the future, of
But isn't
digging
one of
down
the
and,
real problems with the nuclear waste and burial and all those kinds of things is that it almost it rarely sort of goes to plan, right? That something happens with the barrels and they get corroded because there's some mineral in the soil that they didn't take into account. Not that like they're not doing their jobs well and planning well, and
yeah,
you, given the science that we currently have and the technology that we currently have, doing the best we can do. But I think the problem is the idea that, like, okay, if we put them into these barrels, it will basically be fine for a million years. I mean, sort of everywhere we look at the ways that we dispose waste, it turns out that, like, oh, actually we planned poorly because, sea level rise, right? We didn't think that this site was going to be underwater in the next 20 years, but now it is going to be,
yeah.
and it's going to erode all of the structures that we put in place for it to be safe, thinking it was going to be in a desert. It's this million year sort of sense of safety seems to me actually part of the problem.
Yeah, but I also think it's just worth assessing, like, what is the true risk? Like, yes,
Mhm.
if you put it in a place that could end up having water flowing through it, that is a water supply for a city in the future, that would be really bad, right? So there's certainly reasons why you would not want to do that, and as you say, above sea level. But I also wonder, look, of the things that are dangerous in our world, like the effects of climate change, I think are vastly more dangerous and global than this highly regionalized problem where some people might get sick if they unbury this thing at their own great effort they would have to make to go through all this
Right,
concrete and steel and all these things. Like
right,
we're
right.
we're harming ourselves in much bigger and faster ways than that
Right. It's like
particular
focusing
problem.
on a stub toe when your head is exploding.
Yeah. Well, and I'm curious, in your work, it sounds like you've done kind of archaeological work um, in Fiji. Is that right? Or where you're trying to figure out?
Archaeological is a generous word for what I was doing. I was basically a reporter tagging along with a team of conservation biologists who traveled to many different islands around Fiji. Um, and they were looking in particular at reef health, and in particular working with one village that was trying to figure out a way to basically save their reef, because the reefs are, it's income, it's culture, it's food. Without the reef, the whole culture kind of falls apart, and so this one particular village would fall apart. um
But one of the ways
and
they were trying to do that was kind of looking through the waste of the past cultures, right? Which it's
yeah.
interesting to me with nuclear waste is this way. Like my bet is that nuclear waste sites will become a thing that we actually do want to unbury in the future, that we'll get better at dealing with this stuff, and then it'll be a mine for nuclear
Mm-hmm.
material that's very difficult to build to, from scratch. So I think it was
Yeah.
interesting that these people were looking at the history of reefs through the trash middens of
Mm-hmm.
past cultures.
Yeah, that was actually kind of a fluke, because we were traveling. The scientist I was traveling with, his name is Joshua Drew. He was at Columbia at the time. He a friend of his who was an archaeologist was at a site for this sort of ancient people in Fiji called the Lapita people, who were the first people who were there. And he sort of, out of curiosity and because he wanted to visit his friend, we, got in a car that sort of, went on roads for a while and then took a turn into the jungle and sort of went on dirt for a while to this huge beach, where we got out and sort of, took all of our things. And we were actually helping them out because they were trying to get supplies from the main city out there. So that we were trying to get them food and toilet paper and some things. We were just sort of bringing them. So we were sort of carting all this stuff out, and then we get into these little wooden boats, and we take these wooden boats out to the area where they were, sort of on a peninsula, looking at this archaeological site. And the scientists and the archaeologists are kind of chatting and catching up, and they're looking around, and she's like, here are some of the things we found. And she has these cardboard boxes that are, sort of like big square cardboard boxes, and each one has a plastic bag inside, and they're just full of shells and bits of pottery and things that they're kind of slowly sorting through. And he takes a look at this one shell, and like his face just drops, and I see him pick it up, and I was like, what are you seeing? Why is this so fascinating to us? I'm like, it's a giant clamshell, and I don't have the experience to know what it is he's able to see. And it's maybe the size of a soccer ball, a little bit bigger. And he is just astonished, because this is the same species that people are still eating in the village that he is working in, 2 islands away. But they're so much smaller. And he realizes, part of his work as a conservationist is to try and establish a baseline, right? So you have to figure out what it is you're trying to save. And he realizes, looking at this giant clamshell, that the baseline, after only even maybe a couple hundred years, has shifted profoundly. And that already these shellfish are growing smaller and smaller and smaller, either because they're being fished out younger, and so they don't have a chance to grow sort of big and old, um, and also because of ocean acidification, because the shells are sort of weaker, and so they can't grow as big anymore. But like I watched him have this kind of epiphany of this sort of like across centuries, people living in similar ways, eating the same food that is now like a degraded food source. And his job is to try and give the people the information that they need to try and save enough of the food source that's left. And it's a very sobering sort of look at the long view of how people lived and may or may not be able to continue to live in this area.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, fisheries, we have this problem all over, the rarity of the giant bluefin tuna and the giant lobsters that were kind of just a generation ago, something that we
Yeah.
would pull from the ocean, is just increasing and increasing. But I think I think what's interesting about that story and that was from thousands of years ago, the trash middens that they
Yeah.
were looking at, and that
Yeah.
yeah, it also just what we call nature, I think, is always a kind of an interesting definition of what we call a natural state of things. And often we just believe it's from our childhood. It's like nature was the thing that, nature stopped at my childhood, and then, or at least my definition of it. And it's so often you'll find that that the landscape that you're thinking of in its natural state is actually was changed radically. Even here in the United States, there's the fire, the way that the indigenous people used fire to change the landscape and to in effect garden landscapes the way we garden in square plots of land. They were gardening the entire landscape, and that changed it radically before Western culture arrived to document what they saw. But we kind of considered that state to be natural, and I don't think we
Yeah, there's
even
a
know what
name
the
for
natural
this,
state
right?
is.
This is shifting baseline syndrome.
Yeah,
It's a very sort of like, yeah, I'm sure you understand it's a very specific idea that in conservation in particular, you have a real difficulty when you talk about what is the point at which you are trying to sort of halt some kind of environmental degradation. Is it today? Is it 10 years ago when things looked better? Is it when you were a child? And you're right, every generation, including of scientists and conservationists, has this very kind of emotional response about what nature should be and what it should look like, and therefore people tend to put resources into doing conservation acts that will like bring things back a little bit more to like they were when they were a child, which
but it could
may
not
or may
be the
not
natural
be
state. Yeah,
meaningful.
yeah,
Right. But well, then what is the natural state? There's this idea that there is some fixed, like platonic place in the past where nature, what, like stopped or
right.
stood
Is it
still for a very long time.
pre-human contact, or what is it? Yeah,
Right. And I think that is a profound misunderstanding of ecosystems and life on Earth. And I think that when you start looking at nature as a system that we are part of, and that for the last, what is it, 5 billion years or however long we've been on the planet, things have been stable in a way that is relatively conducive to our survival. And so when you start looking at baselines and thinking about what is the thing that we hope nature will be able to provide for us moving forward, um, it's a very different kind of question and a very different set of values than nature is beautiful and nature is something that deserves saving on its own, or saving on its own terms regardless of what it does for us. And this is an ongoing argument in conservation circles and environmental circles. Is like how we even, like, what are the mythologies that we're telling about nature that will help us make the decisions that we make about the resources that we have. um, and I think people do the work of conservation, or do the work of trying to understand ecology for many different reasons. But I don't think that there is like a place that was the best, that was the most natural, that it makes sense for everyone everywhere on the planet to sort of aim toward. That like this is
right.
our baseline, that it's like, given what we have now, what are we going to try and save? It's reminding me of
And
when I
also
was in
just
Fiji.
saving versus creating, I think, is an interesting
Mhm,
one. It's that, just the word conservationist means, right, that you are trying to just save stuff,
mhm,
in some state, rather than creating a new state that's the desirable state. And I
mhm.
think the bummer about that idea is that not only is it kind of it's non-creative, the idea of conserving, but it's really, I think it's really hard, to sell to another generation. I mean, my daughter's 11, and like I don't want to tell her that, she just wants her whole future is putting a fence around nature and trying to make it less bad than my generation did. That's not fun, right? Like, but the idea of creating new versions of nature, or new versions of the state of the natural world that work better with humanity, without being degraded by it, and are more interesting, I think is something that you could sell them on, and they would want to be a scientist to study and to build that world. Um,
Well, it also feels more honest, right? I mean, at this point, we are changing the Earth's atmosphere. We are changing these like fundamental climactic systems. We're changing, weather patterns and, ocean currents and the temperature of the planet and what species are or are not living. The idea that we are not, in fact, actively creating the planet at all times is actually just sort of not true anymore. There may have been a point when it was not true or less true, but sort of acknowledging that we are, I think it was John Mooallem has this great phrase that it goes back to gardening, this idea that we are everywhere with white gloves on.
right.
There's plastic at the bottom of the Mariana Trench. We're not shaping everything already. So if you admit that, however sad and profoundly, however much of a profound loss that may feel, wanting to believe that there's a world where we're not somewhere on this planet. I feel like you kind of have to go through that grief and accept that we are, for better or worse, often worse everywhere. So then what do we do?
Right.
How
Yeah,
do
it's
we
not a
change the
question of,
effects that we're having?
we are all gardeners of this planet
Hmm.
effectively, and the question is just like, are we going to be good at it or not, right? And are we going to do it with care for the natural systems, or disregard those natural systems? And so, but animal species change the environment too, and humanity has been changing the world. That pyrocene version of agriculture that was happening in the Americas, like there's a soot layer that you can find geologically of that time, in as they core down into
Hmm.
lake beds and whatnot. Like they know that these things were happening, and they also know that when disease wiped out the people of when European contact happened, that the oxygen content went up. So it was probably these forests were coming back from that. And so, every species, every natural system is always pushing and pulling against and trying to pull resources out that benefit it and not. It's humans just have done it now at a scale that is obviously so massive and so unsustainable. In normal systems, that would just mean that um, that species would just start dying off because it overused its resources. And so we might be up at that point where the carrying capacity of the Earth starts getting limited by us. We're also strangely, I think, the graphs of world population line up pretty well with the graphs of how much resources we may have left in the next, somewhere in the next 50 to 100 years. Human population is going to start going down by most
I
estimates.
have to push back on that a little bit, because I think that the way that carrying capacity, quote unquote carrying capacity, is calculated, um, is incredibly complex, and it includes not just human population, but also how we use resources and how humans are organized. And so I think that when you start talking about the carrying capacity of the planet in terms of number of humans, you actually remove the possibility of pressing other levers, which are levers that are political and social, which have to do with how we are organized and how we use resources, that seem to me a far more humane set of levers to be pressing before pressing the human lever and reducing human population. And I think that there is a large and vocal and, to me, terrifying contingent on the very far right that has sort of taken up this "there's too many people on the planet" argument,
Oh, yeah.
yeah, right,
It's almost a
to make
eugenic argument.
arguments.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's not even eugenic. I mean, it's just genocidal,
Yeah.
honestly. um,
Well, and also the
and
fact that
so
the populations where they're increasing are on the global south, which are going to be the most affected by climate change negatively, and the places where populations are decreasing on the global north, which the beneficiaries of climate change will be places like Russia, where they have more agricultural land it's their agricultural land is not getting pushed across a border,
mhm,
where in many places in Africa and South America, Central America, their ripe agricultural land is getting pushed across a border that they won't have access to, and that's where the
mhm.
populations are growing. And so you're absolutely right in that the different the graphs don't line up in that sense at all, in a global and a political sense.
Yeah, and I think it's a conversation that more and more people are having, and so it feels very important to talk about what the actual variables are, and also to say that scientists who have tried to calculate some kind of final carrying capacity have been flummoxed. There is no number that is the number of ideal humans on the planet, or given what we know, the number that we can actually sustain. It's 4 million, it's 7 million, it's 12 million, sort of depending on who you ask. And so to begin making sort of policy decisions, or cultural decisions, or decisions about birth control or whatever based on one of these numbers feels to me sort of like absurdly cart before the horse, if at very best, and at worst sort of profoundly racist and xenophobic. But it is interesting to note that, like, the science is not solid on this. There isn't a number. It feels to me like people looking to science to answer a question that science maybe isn't equipped to answer. How many people can this planet hold might not actually be a scientific question. It might have more to do with politics and with economic structures and with transportation systems and food systems and things that science is able to talk about and inform.